Wyoming Territory, August 1882. The sun hung low and mean over the Badlands when she stumbled out of the gulch. Her dress torn halfway up the thigh, sunburn on her cheeks, and blood caked to her temple. Her name was Josephine Maynard, and she had crossed 30 miles of scorched, broken land alone. Merritt Calloway did not see her at first. He was too busy trying to stay upright in the saddle, one arm pressed to the bullet wound just under his ribs. His horse, a steady old sorrel named Flint, climbed the ridge with more sense than speed. Merritt had been shot by a horse thief 4 days ago, and he was not sure if the fever dreams were finally winning when he spotted her barefoot, eyes wide, and looking like she had crawled out of hell itself. Josephine took one look at the man slumped in the saddle and blinked hard. "You real?" she croaked, voice cracked and dry. Merritt blinked against the sun. "Reckon I could ask you the same." She swayed, and Flint stepped forward as Merritt half fell, half slid from the saddle. Pain tore through his side, but he caught her before she hit the ground. They both ended up in the dirt, tangled and gasping. "God!" she whispered, her fingers curling into his shirt. "I thought I was dead." He looked down at her face, dirt-streaked, scraped, but not broken. "You might be," he muttered. "I sure as hell feel like I am." She laughed once, then burst into tears. Merritt gritted his teeth and rolled to his knees. "Come on," he said. "We got to get out of the sun." There was a rocky overhang a few yards up, a place where he had planned to rest before the fever claimed him. Now it would have to be enough for two. He dragged her with him, both of them stumbling and bleeding, and when they reached the shade, they collapsed side by side. Later, after he gave her the last of his canteen and tore a strip from his shirt to bind the worst of her cuts, she spoke again. "My wagon got taken," she said, "by 3 men. My father died 2 days before. I buried him in a gully. Then they came, took the horses, the food, left me." Merritt's jaw tightened. "You come all this way alone?" "I did not have a choice." He looked at her, then really looked at her torn dress, her hands blistered and raw from the sun, the way her chin lifted even now, like she dared the world to knock her down again. "What is your name?" "Josephine Maynard." "I am Merritt Calloway." She nodded once. "You are bleeding." "So are you." They said nothing for a while. Wind moved through the rocks. A hawk circled high above. The Badlands stretched out in every direction. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Nowhere in particular." He shifted, winced. "I was trailing a man who stole a horse. Found him and got a bullet for my trouble." She glanced at the bloodstain on his shirt. "Looks deep." "Feels deeper." Josephine leaned back against the rock and closed her eyes. "I have nothing left." He looked at her, at the curve of her neck, the torn hem of her dress, the way her hands trembled just slightly. "You are still breathing. That is something. Does not feel like enough." He understood that. Too many nights he had thought the same. They stayed under the overhang that night. Merritt's fever worsened, and Josephine, barely steady herself, soaked cloths in the last of the water to keep him cool. He moaned once, called out a name, someone she did not know. She pressed a hand to his brow and whispered, "You are not going to die. Not now." In the morning, he was still alive. They walked with Flint leading the way. Josephine helped him climb into the saddle, then took the reins and led them both east, toward water and trees. They moved slow, and Merritt bit down on the pain, his hand clutching the horn of the saddle. Josephine's torn dress flapped around her knees, her legs scratched and bare, but she did not complain. By dusk, they reached a creek. Merritt slid from the saddle with a groan and collapsed beside the water. Josephine knelt beside him and washed the blood from his side, her fingers careful. "You are lucky," she said. "The bullet missed everything important." "Would not call myself lucky," he muttered. She met his eyes. "You are not dead. That is lucky enough." He watched her as she worked, her lips pressed together, hands steady despite everything. She had not said much about what happened before he found her, but he could see it in her face, the fear, the grit it took to keep walking through the Badlands alone. That night, they built a small fire under the trees. Josephine sat close to him, their shoulders brushing. Merritt stared into the flames. You saved me, she said. He looked over. I was half dead myself. You still stopped. You still helped. He did not answer right away. Then quietly, I could not leave you. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I do not want to be alone anymore. His arm slipped around her without thinking. You are not. They slept close that night. No declarations, no promises, just two people who had nearly died and now clung to the warmth of each other like it might keep them alive. When morning came, Merritt's fever had broken. Josephine helped him back into the saddle and they rode east slow but steady. They did not talk much. They did not need to. Every time she looked up, he was there. And every time he swayed, she reached for him. They had nothing. No money. No home. Just a wounded cowboy, a woman in a torn dress, and a horse with more sense than either of them. But they were alive. And for the first time in days, Josephine let herself believe that might be enough. They followed the creek for 2 days, the shallow water winding east through low hills dusted with sage and buffalo grass. The land softened the farther they went, and the air cooled enough at night to make sleep uneasy without blankets. Merritt's wound pulled with every breath, but the bleeding had stopped and he was steady enough now to ride without drifting. Josephine walked beside him, her steps quiet and deliberate, the skin on her arms peeling from sunburn. She had not asked to ride, and Merritt hadn't offered again. Something about her pride, it sat in her spine the way his pain sat in his ribs. On the third morning, a thin trail of smoke rose in the distance. She saw it first and pointed without a word. Merritt narrowed his eyes. Could be a settler's place, he said. Or someone worse. I can go ahead, she said. They won't expect trouble from me. Maybe not, he said. But I've seen what happens when men stop expecting. She didn't argue. They veered east, keeping low behind the rise, and came upon a homestead half an hour later, a 2-room sod house tucked against a bluff, with a lean-to barn and 2 goats in a pen. A woman with gray-streaked braids was pulling a bucket from the well. Josephine stepped out first. "Ma'am," she called, lifting one hand. The woman straightened and shaded her eyes. She didn't move, didn't smile. "Who's with you?" "A wounded man. We've come from the west. Just need water and maybe a place to rest a day." "Wounded how?" "Gunshot." The woman set down the bucket. "Bring him in. I've got clean linens and a sober hand." They stayed 2 nights. Merritt slept on a pallet in the corner, the wound packed with crushed yarrow. Josephine washed in a wooden basin behind the house, her hands lingering over the soap. The woman, Mrs. Esterlin, loaned her a dress that hung loose in the shoulders but spared her from the worst of the stairs. On the second evening, Josephine sat with her on the porch while Merritt rested, the wind moving over the grass like a whisper. "You're not from out here," the older woman said. "No, ma'am." "Where'd you come from?" "My people had a farm near Springfield. We lost it to taxes. My father said Wyoming had land for anyone willing to work it." "He was right," Mrs. Esterlin said. "But willing's not always enough." Josephine looked out toward the horizon. "He died before we made it to the valley. I buried him under a cottonwood." The woman didn't speak for a long while. Then she stood and touched Josephine's shoulder. "You're still upright. That counts for more than most." The next morning they moved on. Mrs. Esterlin packed bread wrapped in cloth, a tin of salve, and a small sack of oats for Flint. Merritt thanked her with a nod, and Josephine offered a quiet, "We won't forget you." As they rode, Merritt shifted in the saddle and said, "You don't talk like a farm girl." "My mother taught school before she married," Josephine said. "She didn't like lazy grammar." "She's still living?" "No," he didn't press. Around midday, they passed through a grove of cottonwoods where the creek widened into a pool. Merritt dismounted with a grunt and knelt beside the water, dipping his hands in to wash his face. Josephine knelt beside him, and for a long while, neither spoke. When she finally did, her voice was soft. "You didn't ask what I did. When those men took my wagon." His jaw tightened. "Didn't figure it mattered. It does to me." He looked at her. "I stabbed one in the thigh when he tried to take me," she said. "He bled bad." The others laughed and rode off without him. You think he made it? I hope not. A bird called overhead. The water moved slow. They'll be looking for you. The other two. They won't find me. He dipped his head, then said, You always carry a knife? My father gave it to me when I turned 16. Said a girl should know how to cut meat and gut a man just in case. Merritt gave a dry chuckle, then winced and pressed a hand to his ribs. Smart man. She watched him for a moment. You ever been married? No. You? No, why not? She shrugged. Never met a man who made me want to stay. He looked at her, then not just the shape of her face or the way the sun brushed her cheek, but the space behind her eyes. He saw something rooted there, something unyielding. I don't sleep much, he said. Not since the war. Her lips parted, then closed again. I was with the 8th Missouri Cavalry, he added. She nodded slowly. My uncle fought. Lost half his hand at Shiloh. I lost 3 friends at Pea Ridge. The rest came back different. You too. I don't know what I'd look like if I came back the same. They sat in silence after that. Not the strained kind. The kind that settles in when 2 people understand the weight the other carries. By evening, they made camp beneath a stand of pines. Flint grazed nearby, and the wind carried the scent of dry needles and earth. Merritt leaned against a fallen log while Josephine built a fire with practiced hands. He watched her tuck her hair back, the way her fingers moved through the tinder. You ever think of going back east? I did. But there's nothing left for me there. He nodded. Same. She added a dry pine branch to the flames. I don't want to keep moving forever. You won't have to. She turned to him. You sure about that? I'm sure of what I can do. The fire cracked low between them. Josephine wrapped her arms around her knees, staring into the glow. I don't trust easy, she said. I don't ask you to. But I want to. He nodded once. That's enough. She didn't answer, but after a while she leaned her head against his shoulder. And when the wind picked up, he shifted his coat so it covered her too. They sat that way until the fire burned low. No promises. Just the first shape of something solid taking root between them. They reached a rail town at the base of the Wind River Range by mid-September, where the cottonwoods had gone golden and the breeze carried the scent of smoke and tannin from the millworks. The town was called Larkspur, a scatter of clapboard buildings and dirt streets, with the Union Pacific line skirting its edge. Merritt had passed through years back, but it had grown since then. More fences, more noise, more eyes. Josephine stood just inside the livery, watching as Merritt brushed down Flint with one hand and leaned against the stall rail with the other. His healing had steadied him enough to ride without swaying, but his color was still off and the skin around his eyes was drawn tight with fatigue. She hadn't asked how long it had been since he'd stayed in one place. He hadn't volunteered. Do you know anyone here? She asked. No one I'd call a friend, but there's a man runs Freight Rule Maddox. Used to pay me to ride escort through the basin. He might have work. She ran her fingers along a split in the wood. And if he doesn't, then I'll find someone else who does. Always cargo needing a gun hand. She nodded at the saddlebag. You've only got one shirt left. I've worn worse. She hesitated. Could we stay? Just a little while. He met her eyes. You thinking of settling? I'm thinking of breathing. That night, they found rooms above the Mercantile. 2 small beds, 1 cracked mirror, and a washstand that smelled of lye and old wood. Merritt's room faced east, hers west, and the walls were thin enough she could hear him shift in his sleep. By morning, he'd shaved, tucked his shirt in neat, and left to find Maddox. Josephine wandered the town, keeping to the edge of the boardwalk. She stepped into the sewing shop and stared too long at a bolt of pale blue muslin. The girl behind the counter didn't greet her. By noon, she sat on the edge of the creek, skirts pulled above her ankles, watching a boy downstream toss pebbles into a rusted washtub. Her hands itched to do something. Not just survive but make. She remembered her mother's treadle machine, the one she'd sold for rail fare. She remembered the weight of scissors, the pull of thread through muslin. She hadn't stitched anything in over a year. Merritt found her there. I've got work, he said, sitting beside her with a careful bend of the knees. 3 days' ride north, escorting a shipment of tools to a mining camp. Maddox is paying in silver and goods. She looked down at her bare feet in the shallows. Will you come back? He didn't answer right away. Is that what you want? Yes. It is. I'll come back. She nodded once. I'm going to try for work too. He glanced over. Doing what? Sewing. There's a dressmaker's on Main. I saw a help wanted sign in the window. You ever sewn for pay? My mother did. I helped her after school. I can stitch a bodice faster than most can thread a needle. He studied her face. You sure you want to be seen? I'm tired of hiding. Merritt plucked a blade of grass and turned it between his fingers. You'll be good at it. The next morning, he left before sunrise, the freight wagon creaking north behind him. Josephine stood at the edge of town, arms folded around herself, and watched until the dust settled. By the second week of October, she was hemming sleeves and fitting bodices in the back room of Madame Tardieu's shop. The Frenchwoman ran a quiet, orderly business with high expectations and no patience for gossip. She gave Josephine a cot in the attic and $3 a week. It was the first money she'd earned since her father died. She didn't talk about the Badlands. She didn't have to. The way she held herself told enough. Women noticed. Some with caution, some with pity. Madame Tardieu didn't ask questions. She handed Josephine a bolt of calico and said, "Make it clean. Make it sharp." Josephine worked from sunup to sundown, and in the evenings she walked the ridge above town, watching for a dust trail or a rider against the horizon. She didn't say his name aloud. She didn't need to. He returned on the 12th day. She heard Flint's hooves on the packed earth and stepped outside before he could dismount. Merritt looked thinner, dust in his collar, a bruise darkening his chin. But he was alive. "You're early," she said. He swung down. They wanted to get back before the pass froze. She caught the edge of his coat. "Did you eat?" "Not much." "Come on then." She led him inside, up the narrow stairs to the attic. Madame Tardieu was gone to the church supper. Josephine lit a lamp, pulled out the loaf she'd saved, and sliced it without a word. He sat on the cot and watched her work. "Your hands are steadier," he said. "I've been sewing 8 hours a day. You look settled." She passed him the bread. "I'm not really. But it's a start." He tore off a piece and chewed slow. "I bought you something." She blinked. "What?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a sewing gauge, brass-tipped and worn smooth at the corners. "Saw it in a camp store. Thought of you." She turned it over in her hands. "You remembered. You said your mother had one." She folded her fingers around it. "I never thought I'd have another." He stood slowly and stepped close. "I didn't forget anything you said." Josephine looked up at him, the lamplight catching the soft curve of her cheek. "I didn't forget you either." Merritt reached up, brushing his knuckles along her jaw. "You're the first thing in a long time that feels like it might hold." She leaned into the touch. "Then stay." "I will." She stepped forward, closing the space between them. When she kissed him, it was quiet and sure, the way a body breathes after too long underwater. The lamplight flickered. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane. Inside, they stood in the hush, two people with nothing left to prove, only something to build. Together. By early November, frost clung to the porch rails each morning, and the light shifted in a way that made the days feel shorter, the shadows longer. Josephine had moved into Merritt's rented room above the blacksmith shop, though no one in town had spoken on it outright. Larkspur was the kind of place where people noticed but didn't say, where approval came slow, if at all. She rose early, lit the stove with kindling Merritt split the night before, and boiled coffee in the tin pot he'd carried since Arkansas. He'd taken to working in town between freighting jobs, repairing saddles, hauling feed, mending fences. Nothing steady, but enough to keep them in oats and lamp oil. She stitched through the afternoons. Madame Tardieu had begun sending her home with commissions, trusting her eye and her hands. That morning, Merritt set down his cup and said, "I met a man out by the stock pens. He's building a cabin up near the foothills. Wants a second hand through winter." She turned from the stove. "Where exactly?" "About 5 miles northwest. Close enough to ride into town." Josephine poured the last of the coffee into her mug and leaned against the table. You thinking of taking it? I told him I'd consider. He's offering room and board and a calf come spring. She ran her thumb along the rim of the mug. That'd be ours? That's what he said. Her gaze drifted to the window. The morning light glinted off frost-laced glass. We wouldn't be renting anymore. He watched her carefully. I wouldn't leave you here alone. You'd come too. She nodded slowly. There's a woman who sews for the mining camp near there. Madame Tardieu mentioned her once. If she's still there, I might find work. Merritt took her hand across the table. I don't need much, Joe. Just somewhere to stand still for a while. I'd like that too. They moved at the end of the week. The man, Enoch Wilkes, was a widower with quiet eyes and a limp from a fall off a log cart. His cabin was half-built, the roof not yet shingled and the walls still missing chinking in places. But the land was good and the well he dug ran clear. Josephine carried her sewing case in a flour sack and swept out the main room with a borrowed broom. Merritt fixed the stovepipe and laid cedar shingles in the cold. They shared a mattress on the floor and boiled potatoes with salt for supper. Snow came early that year, dry and sudden, crusting the high grass and blanketing the ridge. Merritt's hands split from the cold, but he didn't stop. Enoch gave them space, sleeping in a lean-to he'd built against the barn and only came inside for meals and coffee. He barely spoke, but when he did, it was with care. One evening, Josephine sat piecing a sleeve by lamplight while Merritt rubbed linseed oil into his cracked fingers. She glanced up and said, "Did anyone ever teach you to read proper?" He looked at her. "I can manage signs. Ledger columns. Not much else." She folded the fabric in her lap. "I could teach you if you want." He shrugged. "Not sure I need it." "You don't," she said. "But it might be nice knowing you could." After a pause, he said, "All right." They started in the evenings, she tracing letters in the air with one hand while he followed, lips moving quietly. He fumbled consonants, stumbled over vowels, but never once grew angry. She was patient. He was steady. One night, he closed the reader and said, "You ever want children?" She turned the lamp wick down. "I used to think I wouldn't live long enough to wonder." "I think about it," he said. "Not often, but sometimes." She nodded, thoughtful. "I'd want them to know how to survive, how to tell the truth, how to hold on to something good when they find it." Merritt reached for her hand. "We'd figure it out. Together. Always." Later, after the fire burned low and the night pressed quiet around them, she lay with her head against his chest, listening to the slow rhythm of his breath. His arms around her felt like something earned, something built with days and silence and splinters under the skin. The cabin filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. They had no riches, no fine clothes, no certainty beyond the next sunrise. But they had a roof above, a future to carve, and a love shaped by survival, quiet, resilient, and wholly theirs. The first spring on the Wilkes land came late, as if the snow had taken root and didn't want to loosen its hold. But when the thought had come, it came all at once, water rushing down from the ridges, filling the creek beds until they ran like veins through the valley. The ground softened, the pines shook off their frost, and in the mornings the light came through the cabin window gold and full. Josephine stood in her shift at the doorway one morning, hair braided over one shoulder, watching two quail pick their way through the brush near the fence. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. Merritt was behind her, still warm from sleep, pulling his boots on with slow, practiced hands. "You're up early," he said. "I heard the thaw in the roof last night. Thought I'd see if the fence line held." He stepped up beside her, eyes following hers. "If it didn't, we'll fix it." She turned to him, studying the angle of his jaw, the crease that had deepened near his mouth over winter. "You feel ready to plant?" He nodded. "Enoch says the soil's good for potatoes and cabbage. Maybe some barley if we're lucky. I'd like to try for beans. Pole kind. My mother always said they climbed like they were reaching for something." Merritt rested a hand lightly at her lower back. "We'll give them something to climb." They spent the next weeks turning the soil, renting a mule from the family downriver to break the worst of it. Enoch helped, though his limp had worsened with the wet. Josephine traded a week of mending to the preacher's wife in exchange for a sack of seed. Merritt built a trellis from pine slats and old wire, and when he was done, he stood back with dirt on his palms and said, "That ought to hold." They spoke little during the work. It was the kind of silence that came from knowing what needed doing and trusting the other to do it. When the sun dipped low, they washed up behind the shed, and Josephine would hum quietly as she rinsed the grit from her arms. She never sang words, just melodies remembered from long ago, half faded with time. One evening, while stacking firewood, Merritt asked, "You ever miss Missouri?" She thought a moment. "Sometimes I miss the sound of cicadas. And the river after rain. But no, I don't miss the place." "You miss the people?" "Just one. But I carry her with me." He nodded. "I think about Arkansas sometimes. But it feels like another man lived there." She set a log down gently. Maybe it was. As the weeks passed, the cabin grew fuller, not with things, but with the rhythm of two people building a life. Josephine hung a length of muslin over the window, not for privacy but softness. Merritt carved a peg rail for her aprons. They cooked together most nights, whatever they had, sometimes only beans and flour cakes, but there was always heat in the stove and always enough. One afternoon a letter came. The preacher's boy brought it on horseback, cheeks red from wind. Josephine took it with cautious fingers. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the ink thin and slanted. She read it twice before folding it. Merritt waited, eyes steady. "It's from a cousin of mine," she said. "On my mother's side. Didn't know I was still living. She's in Kansas now. Heard word from a trader who passed through Larkspur, said there was a woman here fitting my description. Sewing dresses with a scar on her left hand." He looked at her palm, the one with the white line running from thumb to wrist. "You want to write back?" "I will. But I won't go." "You sure?" She met his eyes. "I've gone far enough." That night, she wrote by lamplight. Merritt watched the fire, the letter resting in her lap as she sealed it with wax. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Some things, once named, stop hurting as much. In May, they walked the ridge at dusk. The beans had begun to sprout, green threads curling toward the trellis. Merritt picked a wildflower from the edge of the field, bitterroot, pale pink and delicate, and handed it to her. She took it with a small breath. "Do you know what this is?" "No. Just looked like it belonged in your hand." She smiled. "It's one of the first things to bloom after winter. Comes up even before the ground's done thawing. Like you, then." She looked at him, really looked, and something in her face softened into certainty. "I want to marry you," Merritt said. "Not because we have to, because I want to say it out loud. Put it down in the world where others can see." Josephine didn't answer right away. She turned the flower between her fingers. "Yes," she said. They were married the next Sunday, under the cottonwoods behind the Wilkes cabin. The preacher rode out with his wife and brought a small tin cross that he set on a stump. Enoch stood witness, hat pressed tight against his chest. Josephine wore a dress she'd sewn from the last of the fine muslin with 3 shell buttons from Madame Tardew's box. Merritt wore his cleanest shirt and boots scrubbed to near new. They didn't speak vows so much as promised them with their eyes. After, they sat on the porch eating bread and dried apples, and the sun warmed the boards beneath their feet. No music, no grand feast. Just hands held and promises made. That summer, the beans climbed true, the calf was born healthy, and Josephine's cousin wrote back with stories of her children and a pressed violet from the prairie. Merritt read the letter himself, slow but sure, and when he finished, he kissed her temple and said, "Next one, I'll read it aloud." Years passed, quiet and full. The cabin grew into itself, the fields tilled wider each season. They built a second room when the baby came, a daughter with hair the color of sun-touched wheat and eyes that watched the world with quiet care. They named her Clara, after no one in particular, but the name settled over the house like morning light. Josephine stitched dresses for girls up and down the valley, and Merritt carved toys from pine knots and taught Clara the names of the stars. They never left the land, never needed to. Visitors came and went, but the rhythm of their life stayed true. Some nights, as the wind curled around the eaves and the stove glowed low, Josephine would lie beside Merritt with their daughter asleep between them and say, "I didn't know life could feel like this." And he'd answer, voice low and steady, "It can. It does." And it did for all their days.